There are political defeats, and then there are constitutional slaps. This week, the Supreme Court did something Donald Trump did not expect and absolutely did not want. It struck down his use of emergency powers to impose sweeping tariffs. And what followed wasn't calm leadership. It was spin, deflection, and a scramble to find another legal doorway. Let's be clear about what happened.
Let's just level set here. What the Supreme Court did was a very narrow reading of the president's authority under the IEEPA tariffs. We have other tariff authorities which have been functioning, Section 232 tariffs, Section 301 tariffs. And Dana, when you say it's a big question, that's bad framing because the Supreme Court didn't even address that. The Supreme Court remanded it down to a lower court, and we will follow what they say, but that could be weeks or months when we hear them. So the Supreme Court did not address refunds.
Sure, they didn't address refunds. That is clearly going to be up to you, which is why
No, Dana, it is not up to me. It is
not you.
It is not up to the administration. It is up to the lower court. Let's just be clear on that.
Okay.
The court ruled that the president cannot use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the Emergency Economic Authority, to impose these tariffs. In plain English, you don't get to call trade policy an emergency just because you want leverage. That's Congress lane. That's taxation power. Taxation power. That's constitutional separation of powers. And this wasn't some liberal bench rebellion. Even Justice Neil Gorsuch, a Trump appointee, wrote that Americans fought a revolution because they didn't want taxation by executive decree. They wanted elected representatives, not a king controlling the purse. That's not subtle. That's a message. Now, how did the administration respond? Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went on television and immediately tried to downplay the ruling. He called it very narrow. He insisted the Supreme Court didn't address refunds. He said it's up to lower courts now. Notice the pattern. When asked whether $134 billion collected under these tariffs would be refunded, he refused to answer directly. When pressed, he pivoted to GDP numbers. When pressed again, he said he'd wait for the lower court. That's not clarity. Oh, that's stalling. Because here's the reality. If the tariffs are ultimately unlawful, that money has to go somewhere. And businesses across America, especially small importers, have been carrying the cost. But instead of addressing that head-on, the administration pivoted to something else. They invoked Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a rarely used authority, allowing temporary tariffs for 150 days. Translation: if one door closes, find another. And Bessent made it clear. This is a bridge. During that 150-day window, they plan to escalate Section 232 and 301 tariffs authorities that have survived past legal challenges. This isn't retreat. It's rerouting. The Supreme Court said you can't do it this way. So the strategy became, fine, we'll do it that way. That's not outrage, that's procedural maneuvering. But politically, it's combustible. Because Trump has built a massive part of his economic identity on tariffs. Tariffs are the symbol, the branding, the promise of reshoring factories and crushing trade deficits. So when the Supreme Court narrows that authority, it's not just legal.
Well, the Justice Department told a federal appeals court in this very case last year, if tariffs imposed on plaintiffs during these appeals are ultimately held unlawful, then the government will issue refunds to plaintiffs.
Again, I'm not going to get out ahead of the court. We will follow the court's direction, but as I said, that could be weeks or months away. That decision was not rendered on Friday.
What do you think? You're the Treasury Secretary. What do you think should happen? In the past, you have said it is possible.
Again, I want to point to what we're doing. The president the administration remains undeterred in reshoring American factories and getting rid of these massive trade imbalances. That's the big story here, is that we are immediately going to go to Section 122 tariffs, and that the revenue for the U.S. Treasury for 2026, the projections are unchanged.
Okay, I'm going to ask about the new tariffs that the president talked about over the weekend. But before we move off of this, I know in the past, before the Supreme Court went with its ruling, you said any tariff refund would be corporate welfare and would likely not get passed on to the American consumers. What about the countless small business owners in America, many of whom have spoken with CNN, who say they're bearing the cost and have been bearing the cost of tariffs?
Again, I'm not going to get out ahead of the court. We don't know what arrangements were made. We don't know what foreign suppliers, whether they discounted what's happened. So let's just focus on the news on Friday, and then I'll come back after the lower court rules.
Yeah, it's as the Treasury Secretary, it's hard to believe that you don't have an opinion or know where these revenues, over $100 billion, are going to go, or have an opinion on where they should go.
Again, I had an opinion, and the court did not agree with my opinion. So, Dana, I'm going to wait for the lower court opinion.
Okay, so let's talk about what is happening right now, which is the president did sign an executive order Friday night calling for that 10% global tariff, and then he raised it to 15% on Saturday. As you mentioned, he's invoking Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 to justify these new tariffs. That's a section of the federal law that no president has ever invoked. What does the president think will happen in the court, or why does he think it will stand up to legal scrutiny?
This 122 authority is good for 150 days. During that time, we will do studies on Section 232, which will be done by Commerce Department, Section 301, which will be done by USTR. Those tariffs remain in effect and have withstood more than 4,000 challenges since the president's first term. So during that time, it is very likely that those studies will result in higher 232s, higher 301s, and it will get us back to the same tariff level. We've been in touch with our foreign trading partners, and all of them want to keep the trade deals that have been set. Dana, we've had great economic results over the past year. 4.1% second quarter GDP, 4.3, 4.4 in the third quarter, and it would have been a very strong fourth quarter if the Democrats hadn't shut down the government to hurt the American people.
On that note about the new tariffs that he put in place, you're right that it is 150 days, and then Congress has to make it permanent, or has to approve it, I should say. How do you have the votes, or how do you see those votes coming to fruition, especially with a Congress that doesn't entirely support the tariffs, at least not enough with this narrow majority?
Again, Dana, I think you missed what I just said, is that the 122, we'll see what Congress does, but the 122 is likely a 5-month bridge during which studies on Section 232 tariffs and Section 301s are done. And I think it's highly likely that those tariffs will rise up, and that the 122s could disappear after 5 months. So, that this is more of a bridge than a permanent facility.
Let's talk about what Gorsuch's opinion really signals. He emphasized that the Constitution gives Congress alone the power to tax. That's not academic. That's foundational. But the executive branch can simply reclassify trade deficits as emergencies to bypass legislative approval. That's the core of the ruling. And yet, the administration's public message was essentially, nothing changes. Revenue projections unchanged. Trade policy unchanged. Strategy unchanged. That tone matters. Because this wasn't framed as a loss. It was framed as a technical adjustment. But markets watch signals. Businesses watch signals. Trading partners watch signals. And what they just saw was the Supreme Court telling the White House, your authority has limits. For months, critics argued that the emergency tariff approach stretched the law beyond recognition, that it centralized too much economic power in the executive branch. Now the court has agreed, at least partially. Does that mean tariffs disappear? No, please. Does it mean executive trade authority vanishes? No, but it does mean the boundaries are real. And when even conservative justices emphasize separation of powers, that's not partisan warfare. That's constitutional guardrails. Here's the political tension now. The administration says the ultimate goal isn't revenue, it's rebalancing trade. They cite shrinking deficits and rising investment. They argue trillions are flowing back into American manufacturing. But if that's true, why fight so hard to preserve emergency authority? Why not go through Congress and lock it in legislatively? Its congressional approval means negotiation, compromise. Voter is that aren't guaranteed. If you believe trade policy should be debated openly in Congress, if you think emergency powers should actually be emergencies, and if you want political analysis that cuts through spin instead of repeating it, like the video. Subscribe for unapologetic breakdowns. And tell me in the comments,